Welcome to the Staff and Trenchcoat. I'm Raymond Magdalen here as always with Pope Jupiter.
Hello.
Today we are covering The Book of Doors by Gareth Brown. And this was Pope's pick, and so I will jump in with my impressions and then we'll get into our loosely organized bullet point discussion. I
Absolutely.
I generally enjoyed the text. There were some significant problems that came about as the book went on. This was definitely another one of those reads where for about the first 20 to 40%, I thought that I was looking at an absolute slapper. And
Yeah.
then there were some reveals and wrinkles that appear that we'll get into that I think dragged it down to where I probably wouldn't recommend the book. And I've got some fairly strong opinions about the world building choices and the magic system and all of that, but the pros themselves were really good. There was really no cheesy dialogue, and obviously no like errors or anything like that.
Mm-mm.
And across the board, it was written really strongly, and there were some really good emotional moments. Particularly the way that the author constructed the story between the main character Cassie and
Mr. Weber.
Mr. Weber. That actually I thought was beautiful. The way that that was, at least from a feel good. Well, I maybe not feel good, but the author managed to pull on your heartstrings quite a bit
Yes.
in the text, and I'm often reminded of there's a like a clip of Tolkien in his office, and I don't know if he actually has the like corncob pipe when he utters this particular thing, but
Always has the corncob pipe. Let's be
pretty
clear.
pretty much always. Anyway, he it's when they're talking about, was the Lord of the Rings an allegory? And he says, no, et cetera, et cetera. And then he says, but it's a, like most grand stories or something like that, I'm approximating, they're about death. And very much the Book of Doors is a story about death.
Yeah.
And in a more overt, immediate way than many of the other texts that we have read for the podcast, even if you could argue that a lot of them were ultimately about death. And yeah, I guess that's all I'll say in terms of, initial impressions. How did you feel reading through it?
Yeah, I agree. This was one where I went into it, and the first good chunk of it, I was like, "Yeah, this is cool. This is interesting. This is a fun, fresh take." And then there were just a few sort of fatal blows that ultimately had me kind of just blah about the book. I don't hate it. It's well constructed. The things make sense, and um, for probably the first time on this show, maybe since like Knight Errant, we have a complete story, a complete arc.
Well, Knight Errant was part of a series.
Right, but it was more of a traditional, book one where they had a more or less complete arc, with some tales for future stories, if I remember correctly. But that's irrelevant. This is not explicitly part of a series. This is just the Book of Doors. It is one of one.
Right, it's a
Um,
standalone novel.
Now, I do think there is ample room for the author or fans to expand on the universe, if either takes a fancy.
Well, just because you can doesn't
Doesn't
mean
mean
you
you
should.
should. Yeah, it's fucking time travel, man.
Yeah. So before we get into the bullet list, I do want to interject a quick, a returning segment, which is Magdowan is mad.
Yeah.
And that is the titles for the chapters are
Oh,
egregious.
I looked
And
through it and I was like, "Oh, cool. I will have no idea how far I am into the book based on the chapters." I just kind of, because I'm not gonna memorize the different chapter. There's like 3 different deaths of Mr. Weber. There's uh like 2 different The Plan Part 2s or some shit. No, that awful.
Most of the chapters tell you exactly what's going to happen inside the chapter, most of the titles. And so there's this feeling of you're never surprised by what's happening in the text, because if a character is going to return, the author just tells you they're returning.
Hmm.
If there's going to be some change of plans or whatever, then the chapter will be titled A Change of Plans, so on and so forth. And I hated it. And I wish authors would stop doing it. I don't know. I don't understand what the intended, function of those titles are. If it's just, I don't want to be like everybody else and just have numbered chapters, or if it's they're like writing down to the reader, like they want to make sure that you know what's going to happen in the chapter because they think you're too dumb to understand the narrative otherwise. I don't know what's going on there, but I in this book in particular, I felt like it legitimately and measurably decreased my immersion. And I guess that's all I'll say about that. I hated the chapter titles.
I did this when I was much, much younger, writing chapter titles, which more or less give away what happens. And I thought I was being like clever and whatever, which I was not. I was just being a dumb shit.
Right. And so, well, let's jump in. Do we want to do gender first or violence?
I don't know that there's a whole lot to say about gender. It seemed pretty egalitarian to me. There wasn't a lot of there was some sort of chivalry stuff, but it was mostly, the protagonist is a woman and she is very powerful. I'm sure you have some insight that's going to make me look like an idiot. But that was my read. That it didn't seem to really have a lot to say about gender that I read.
I don't think
Please enlighten
I
me.
don't have anything, you know, that's going to make you look like an idiot, but I did notice that the descriptions of male characters consistently made mention of whether or not they were handsome. That was the main
Mm,
crux of what was being described. And there's even the rare reversal of the just smile, baby, where Drummond is described as only being handsome if he smiles. If he's not smiling, then he's just uglier.
I
And
missed that.
I don't know if
Mm,
I've encountered that before in such a stark way. And there's very little description of the female characters. One passage comes to mind where the main character has gotten older, and so there's a self-referential, self-deprecating moment where she says something to the effect of like, "Yep, I'm back, and I'm older and saggier," or something like that.
mhm.
But in terms of the when we're in the voice of the narrator, I couldn't tell you whether or not the women were attractive, not attractive, and I don't know that that's important. But it did strike me that there seemed to be a great deal of description as to whether or not the men were attractive. And again, it was
Right.
very much linked to their age. And I have to admit, I think with every passing year, I like that convention less. And I- you know, and we have a male author writing multiple female protagonists, which I think is fine. But I do also think it's worth mentioning that for the most part, aside from the narrator voice descriptions, you could just swap the genders of any character and it wouldn't have mattered.
Yeah.
And that's all I'll say about that. So jump into violence. It sounded like before the show that you had something to say on that. I mean, obviously I have some things I could say, but
This book didn't really seem to have a lot of what most people would think of as violence. There weren't a lot of people throwing punches. There were only a few gunshots, that kind of thing. But the way the books are used is pretty hardcore. You've got the Book of Pain, which forces someone to feel such intense, escalating pain that they'll do anything to make it stop. You've got the Book of Despair, which can make someone despair into make them feel so depressed, so hopeless that they will literally bash their own head in. There are a lot of sort of visceral scenes, and I thought they were good and they had a place. I thought that they were nothing felt too gory. I'm thinking specifically like of the scene where she liquefies a guy in the basement.
Yeah, there's the she liquefies one guy and
She buries the other
yeah,
one
she
inside. It's
suffocates him.
hmm
Yeah, I think I disagree with you. I think the way that the villain was constructed, I thought was pretty lazy.
Oh yeah, I
And
hate the villain.
it was
Hate her.
and I don't hate her because she's evil. I hate the way
hmm
she was written because it was easy and ham-fisted. And I mean, it seemed like something that would come out of like sitting in a group discussion and just spitballing and brainstorming like what are the most mean things that somebody could do, and then she just does the thing. I mean, she just walks up and casually just uses the book of despair on a child,
Uh-huh.
and she
Yeah,
wantonly.
it's so Snidely Whiplash.
I don't I that reference falls.
Wacky Races. He's the Hanna-Barbera mustache twirling villain.
I don't know what Hanna-Barbera is, but the mustache twirling villain is exactly right. This is not a complex character that happens to be on the wrong side. This is just a complete manifestation of everything that is evil. I mean, aside from, well, no, I was just going to say, she doesn't even, the only thing worse or more cliche that could be done was animal abuse, but she does that too.
Yeah.
She just goes
Um,
into a forest, and there's the constant description of like, and she enjoyed it. The author wanted to make sure that I'll use the phrase, but it's the cruelty is the point. There's another avenue
uh-huh.
of discourse where that phrase means something
Right.
slightly different, but in this context, it was this completely flat, completely evil character without any depth, and the reveal at the end
Oh
that
God.
that was so bad.
You know,
And
I think tell me how much you think this would improve the story if instead of the pain of Hugo Barbary being released from his mortal coil and hovering in the air, and she just happens to jump through it because she's jumping off a fucking fountain. What if instead she is like a manifestation of time to correct nope, that's still stupid. Never mind. She's just an awful character and shouldn't exist.
yeah, I mean, we're gonna get there real soon because the magic system itself actually just causes the narrative to fall on its own sword
hmm
in a lot of ways. But the problem with doing a villain this way is that nobody I just don't think people care. There isn't any way to get emotionally invested in the story when it is so black and white in that way.
When you
And
have a villain like that, the only choice is to kill them. There's no reasoning with someone like that. There's no convincing them to stop doing what they're doing. She's intractable. She is the determinator.
yeah, and there's all these descriptions of, she tortured her own parents, and it it just seemed like a caricature of evil. And with the sophistication of the writing style and the potential that the magic system had to have the main antagonist be this silly, I thought was a real shame. Then I guess real quick so that we can just get into the meat and potatoes here. The you read me the tagline, and it what
Would you
was
like
it?
me to read it again or
Yeah, hit us again.
a debut novel full of magic, adventure, and romance? The Book of Doors opens up a thrilling world of contemporary fantasy for fans of a bunch of other books.
So the first two, fine,
Yeah, absolutely full of magic and adventure.
but there wasn't any romance that I was able to detect aside from a couple passing phrases and maybe a couple loose implications.
Yeah, like this is the kind of story where you can definitely view it as one where everybody paired off, Lund paired off with. I mean, actually, I think the author was rooting for a love triangle or thruple between Izzy, Lund, and Izaki.
Right. But
But
I mean, legitimately, there's more kissing and physical touching between Cassie and her grandfather than there is between
mhm.
anybody else. So I
There's
just
more
don't.
physical intimacy between Izzy and Cassie than between any other two people in the story.
Yeah, I think it was disingenuous to bill the book as containing those three things. What was it? Magic, adventure, and romance.
Mhm.
It's 49.999% of the first two each, and then point zero zero, a few zeros, and then 1% romance, because there are a couple implications. But if you were somebody who is not a huge adventure person and not a huge magic enjoyer, but you're like, oh, okay, I could get into this if there's some romance, you will be disappointed,
Right.
and you won't enjoy the book. And so, I mean, does it fuck? Absolutely not. I think we've probably said all that needs to be said about that.
No, the relationships in this book are incredibly cerebral and mental,
Right.
which that's not a bad thing. I think that's an excellent thing, but it just does not fuck.
Absolutely not. And so, the magic system. There are, I mean, this is basically Deus Ex Machina, the novel, and the magic books of nebulous origin seem to mostly have one power each. Although, as the book progresses, it starts to become clear that the abilities that the books have are somewhat open to interpretation and have
Yeah.
multiple uses. But the big problem is that she introduces, or well, not the character doesn't introduce, the author, so I guess it would be he introduces essentially a god tier power, and it just ruins the whole story. And the Book of Doors can not only transport you to any door in the present, but also any door in the past. And the implication would be that you could also go to the future, but that doesn't actually come up. Aside from, like, once they've gone into the past, they will return to the future.
Right.
I can't think of a better example of, I've used this construction a few times in the podcast, but I think it's a good one in this case. If I was to teach a class about time travel, this novel would fall into the how to do it badly.
Yeah.
Number one, the books have no cost. They appear to be able to be used indefinitely with there being.
They explicitly say that, like for the Book of Shadows, which requires you removing a piece or a whole page, that it regenerates.
Yeah, so it's infinite in terms of the number of uses, but when you use one of the books, it doesn't fatigue you, or if you use the Book of Pain on someone, there's no like cost to you. You can, if you possess these, you just have that power with no caveat.
Yeah,
And
that they're absolute god tier artifacts. That small kudos to the author realizing that as soon as people realize this exists, there would people chasing them down. I think they probably would have had a greater impact on society if they existed in the form described. But I'm definitely not trying to shit on the author for not writing his alternate history where Charlemagne had the Book of Pain.
right, but there was for me at least, a large degree of difficulty in maintaining my belief in the story. because there's loose mention of like, well, some governments, there are people in them that are after the books, but artifacts of this power level would have drawn in, it would not have been kept secret. And throughout the book, they're they do things, and not once does anybody call the police, or there's just never any mention of the ramifications of the stuff that happens in terms of the world that surrounds it. I mean, in Cassie's apartment, they're constantly being thrown around and breaking stuff and so on and so forth, and nobody ever calls the cops. No random passerby ever comes to investigate. And
Right.
you have the villain just walking into the middle of a park and killing a bunch of Drummond's friends, and that just never seems to be an issue. There's the this
And
hotel.
it's not like she comes in and just like blankets it in mist and chokes them all out. Like they're screaming and yelling and running around. Like New York City is busy, but people will notice that kind of thing.
Yeah, just
Like,
people doing obvious magic and killing each other in public areas, definitely.
but there's never there's I mean, one major issue that a lot of authors have is failing to show the quote unquote NPCs. They'll have a scene and there won't be a bum on they won't necessarily mention the bum on the park bench unless it's important. But we have scenes where those people would be like people would be drawn to them and no one ever comes. No one ever uh, investigates these bizarre happenings, these strange noises, these not so strange noises that also draw people's attention, like a woman screaming and the sound of breaking furniture and glass and a man making noise or gunfire. It's the author was clearly trying to go for this kind of. I believe I described it as what if Jumper and John Wick had a kid and that kid was a fucking nerd? Jumper being the movie with Anakin Skywalker, where he has the ability to teleport at will, and John Wick being John Wick. So it kind of had that vibe where they were going for like in Jumper, there's this conflict between the Jumpers and the Paladins, I think is what they were called. But the Paladins were kind of implied to be like this pseudo governmental body, and the Jumpers were just kind of trying to like survive, man. So that was like the core conflict. And I think the author was trying to go for that kind of thing, but none of the bad guys have that kind of institutional teeth.
Mm,
These are all wealthy people or just determined people who are just private citizens, as far as we're aware.
right. I feel like the books, as described in the text, the amount of power that individuals have and their willingness to utilize that power in public is in conflict with the idea that this is somehow existing under the view of larger institutions. And I think absolutely, particularly the US government, would have been involved, and major world powers the world over
Right.
would have been seizing these objects. And then there's so much to say that I fear I'm gonna derail us, but the guns were a problem for me. Some characters had them, some didn't, but most of the people that had the books had almost nothing else in place to protect themselves. No training,
No.
no weapons. I mean, like one or two guys had like a bodyguard situation going on, but not really. The only person that had any kind of an infrastructure to protect themselves and their books was the bookseller. And she had like two security guards
Yeah.
or something. She's making a sale in the tens of millions. And she knows
Among
the people
people who are
she's
literal among people who are literally pursuing books which give you godlike powers.
yeah, and so her solution is I'm going to have the auction in person, and I'm going to get some of the people to just give their books to my guy, and I'm going to have like two security guards whose training is so poor than a 90 something year old man has faster twitch reflexes.
Yeah.
And I don't want to harp on it because I've done it a lot in the podcast and I can imagine it becoming abrasive to the listener, but this was another book where I just didn't buy it. The narrative was too silly for me to be
Yeah.
invested, and there was a huge disparity between the writing style and the way the narrative was presented by the author, which I thought was, this was not meant to be a silly romp. This was meant to be taken as an emotional and thrilling, uh, reverently told story.
Yeah,
And
it ends with her sitting there with Mr. Weber as as he dies for the third time. Like, this is supposed to be a sincere, sentimental piece,
right,
and the tone is just goofy and all over the place. The villain is, it's so bizarre that this is printed in 20 goddamn 24. This villain, any a middle school, a junior high English teacher would look at a story with this villain and say, you need to develop it, unless it was specifically a broad farce, a broad spoof.
yeah, but this does not read as a spoof.
No, it reads as a sincere piece and so the villain stands out.
And I mean,
Both of
the
the
villain's
villains,
catchphrase is "Give me your books" in all capitals. It's wild. the The construction of the villain is just really bad. But so turning to the
well,
actual books themselves, we have the time travel book. We have the book of healing, which appears to just be the mystical panacea. There's the book of luck, which that's another, I feel like a an interesting project that we could do as like a supplementary video would be to make some kind of a codified tier list of magical powers, and you know, organize them by their threat level to the rest of your
mhm.
narrative, because I would say things like time travel, immortality, the ability to heal any wound, and things like that are
the
close
book
to
of
the top.
safety, the book of safety is bullshit on toast.
Right. It's too dangerous to the narrative. Maybe a really skilled author could include one of these powers and construct the narrative around it and put limits on it and have the characters that utilize it do it in such a way that it doesn't drag the story down. But this particular story is full of these abilities that are so obscenely powerful that any use of them is comical, and the ability to have the rest of the story matter is deteriorated. The
I
Go
I
ahead.
would have the Book of Doors embedded in my skin if I got it. That way, if because I know that anyone who's coming after me is willing to kill me for it anyway. That way, I'm not gonna fall asleep and they pick it out of my pocket. No, they gotta cut me open to get that shit out. And
Well,
that way, oh, you throw me in a cell? Okay. I envision my bedroom and open the cell door.
yeah, and our main character goes back in time. We never really get a concrete answer on whether or not the things that she's doing can change the past, although it seems like it does, because she is able to go back in the end and give Mr. What was his name again?
Weber.
Mr. Weber the book, and then he gives it to her. There's this kind
No, it's
of,
just a bootstrap paradox. It's just a stable time loop.
right.
She got the book from Mr. Weber, went on all the adventures, and then gave it back to him at the end.
Yeah, that's, I think that's Ucky.
Oh yeah, it's terrible. It's awful. It's grotesque because that means that the Book of Doors has no actual origin point. But hey, that's what happens when you fuck around with time travel.
As I said, it deteriorates the rest of the narrative's weight because you're always at that point assuming that that power is always in play.
Right,
So I think a good example of another book that could be really powerful if it had been used, but that would not accomplish this would have been the Book of Flame. Really, really powerful to be able to just conjure fire, and
mm-hmm,
maybe there would have been some interesting side interpretations of what that book could do that could have been really cool. But a character could have that book and use it and then put it aside, and the reader is not going, okay, but this is dumb because we know they have the Book of Flame.
right.
The Book of Doors is not like that. The time travel element makes it impossible for it to not subsume the rest of the narrative. And,
Honestly, the time travel element is just a cherry on top. The way the actual like physical travel works is obscene. It doesn't matter which way the door opens or if it's locked or not.
no,
Once you've
it
used
does.
no,
Yeah, I thought the door had to be unlocked.
no, I'm 99% sure they both open a door the wrong way and open a locked door to step through the Book of Doors door.
Okay. I mean, I'll buy that.
Um,
I don't remember enough to, and I don't think it's a valuable distinction.
right. So I mean, there's no you lock them in a room, uh, unless the room doesn't have a door. In which case, how you would you nail them in a box or something? Uh, there's no way as long as they have the Book of Doors they to be trapped. And when you add the time travel in, any amount of time that the bad guy has the Book of Doors, they have won because they have time travel and it's perfect time travel, which allows them to go wherever they need to go at the right time, only limited by there being a door nearby.
Yeah,
And you have
this is
infinite
a
do-overs.
yes. The time travel element elevates the Book of Doors to being a novel killer of a superpower. I thought at the beginning that we were in for more of a light-hearted fantasy romp where the character was going to go on some adventure and it was going to mostly be they could just travel all over the world. For a while, I suspicioned that maybe it was going to turn out that the Book of Doors could take you to other worlds. I think that would have
Yeah,
been kind of fun. And, or it could have been that the Book of Doors could also take you to places that you imagine.
yeah,
And that could have been a fun type of story. I don't remember where I read this, but I thought that the narrative itself was meant to be a reification of this idea of like the power of books. And if that was the case, I kind of missed it because the here again it just seemed like the most powerful thing that you could imagine would just be time travel and nothing else really escaped in order to be, you know, immediate in my mind as I was reading.
the only real thing I could see is the way books can bring people together, but the things that bring people together about books are not the things that bring people together in this narrative. The things that bring people together in this narrative are survival and really powerful books that do cool things. I mean, if I found a book that let me create illusions or made me immune to harm, I would definitely wait, what the fuck am I saying? I would tell no one about that. I would lock that against my skin and then no one would know about it forever.
Well, yeah, I mean, I can see in the case of somebody actually having a book like that, I think a lot would hinge on whether or not they knew that certain other books existed.
Right.
Because if you had the Book of Doors, the Book of Luck, the Book of Healing, and the Book of Safety, then you're functionally immortal as
Right.
well. And so then you would literally be God. And I guess now it's as good a time as any. I smell Judeo-Christian elements here. Sniff, sniff, sniff. I smell Jesus. And there was this moment where she kind of goes through a doorway. How did they describe it in the narrative? It was
The nowhere and nothing,
right.
or the nothing and nowhere, or something like that.
There's a Messiah thing going on
Yeah.
where she just kind of believes that she made the books and that they all belong to her. And
Yeah, I was okay with her being there and that the ideas coming from her mind when she started explicitly claiming ownership of them and being like, "No, those are my books." I was like, "Slow your roll. You do not know what happened. That was a fluke."
right, and so are is that a teaser for future novels where she becomes the bad collector? Perhaps. It also, like I said, it smacked to me of savior,
Yeah,
God complex,
a
et cetera,
literal
et
Deus
cetera.
Ex,
Yeah, and
Deus Ex Librum, I guess. I don't know.
I guess yeah, and I didn't enjoy that either. And we never really get. I just feel like there were so many things that could have been more interesting than just throwing in time travel, like getting into how were the books written, what does the text in them mean. They could figure out how to create more of the books. The
No, they're just random symbols from her imagination.
right, the
Like it's so limited. Like by creating that origin point, you have now sort of created a hard limit on what the books can be because if they all came from her mind, then I don't know. It just felt like explaining those origins was such a mistake.
yeah, I think so. I feel like that was another misstep in the narrative that took me further down the road to not liking the book and not wanting to recommend it.
Yeah,
Yeah, and the villain had the Book of Mist that was kind of cool, and there was the Book of Control where they it was essentially telekinesis that
yeah,
was kind of neat. And I liked the degree of wonder in terms of they were never clear on how many books there were and how many of them were unnamed in the text. I thought that was kind of intriguing. And I like the idea. I'm a sucker for the secret library archetype.
yes.
Again, I just wish that would have been more the focus of the novel and less the time travel and having to stop the mustache twirling caricature villain. But lest we go on and on, you had this point here, the Izzy fake out. So rant if you need a rant.
Yeah, so this is one of the more visceral moments when they described Izzy getting shot. I distinctly remember descriptions of uh, I believe brain and blood and bone, one good eye, one remaining eye, these kind of things.
Absolutely.
And this is the catalyst for Cassie to sort of give up and want to go nowhere. This Izzy's death is literally what creates the books. And then they get out of it for free. Oh, she created an illusion because she had her hand in her pockets while she was running for her life, and created an illusion of her being shot to keep her safe. What the fuck? When Izzy just came back and that was their whole explanation, I was mad.
Well,
Because
that's another problem with the time travel and the power level of these artifacts is that death means almost nothing
yeah.
because you always expect that there's going to be a loophole. And this author, to my taste, fell into that trap just wholesale
Mhm.
and did nothing to mitigate it whatsoever.
For someone who I think actually did think about I think there was enough breadcrumbs laid that the author wants us to believe that the world is, I'm not sure what the exact term is, mechanistic, deterministic, where there's one timeline, and that anything you go back in time and do, you have already done. So, that being the case, it's insulting that he just decided to have Izzy just, well, I guess she just magically created an illusion to keep her safe. And that's it. There's no moment where, a second Cassie shows up and gives Izzy the Book of Illusion and said, hold on to this, it's gonna keep you safe. There's none of that happens after the fact. Nothing. It's just, oh, I guess she was luckily clutching the book. And it bothers me because I liked Izzy, and I felt that killing her was a good way of sort of upping the stakes, especially with what happens after, and just bringing her back was just like, oh well, fuck you then.
Right.
I even kind of liked the way he sort of made it seem like Izzy was more important, only to find out later that the reason why Izaki was told to protect Izzy was because Cassie told the bookseller to. I actually kind of liked that little red herring plot, not even a twist, turn. But yeah, just the way he killed Izzy and then just brought her back, just really burned me.
Well, I was already burned by that point, and so I was well into the, you know, everything that was happening was just okay. Yeah, because of course that would be the way it goes. Should just go back in time, or one of the books will just have an ability that was not previously described, or you just
Yeah,
have nothing has any consequence because the magic system is poorly done. And so you don't have any kind of a gauge for what's going to happen next. And the conflict between the main characters and the mustache twirling caricature villain is silly. And so you end up with this kind of this weird situation where the mishmash between the events of the story and the underlying kind of emotional tale about Cassie's connection with
Weber.
Mr. Weber is just weird. And I guess this will be my final remark is that I liked the way that the narrative was constructed in the sense that you had this interaction between Weber and Cassie at the beginning of the book, and then it unfolds throughout the rest of the narrative the reason that he was actually there in the bookstore to give her that book, and the idea of her going back in time and having to live 10 years where she actually lives with Weber and their relationship grows, and there's a sadness because they have to part ways, and she doesn't tell him he's going to die, but he knows that he has to give her that book, but he also has to kind of play the role of not knowing her very well, even though he
Right.
does. And then the moment where, she's able to, at the end she sort of uses the power to go back and give comfort to two dying people. And I think that is lovely, but there is an undertone of, because obviously she doesn't just go and take the book of healing or the book of safety and go back and save those people. Instead, she lets God's plan unfold. And there is that undertone, which is not to my taste necessarily, but the the relationship between Cassie and Mr. Weber I thought was wholesome and touching and enjoyable. And I thought that particular part of the narrative was executed really well. And I felt the things that I think the author wanted me to feel when I was reading those things. But unfortunately, the rest of the book was covered with this magic system that just seemed far too haphazard for me.
Yeah. It occurs to me that, speaking of Mr. Weber, The way he reacted to hearing the story about him in Rome, again, she told him that story, which prompted him to start telling her over and over again so that she would remember that story. He never chose to reveal that to her.
Right.
That's the weird thing about bootstrap paradox is that there are things with no actual origin. He told her that story, and as a result, or she told him that story, and as a result, he would go on and tell her that story over and over again when she was younger. Time travel is stupid. You probably shouldn't have it in your stories. This book was better than it could have been and worse than it should have been.
Was
That
it better or worse than Knight Errant?
I think it was better. It definitely hit some better emotional notes, and the characters were certainly more interesting, at least the protagonist ones. Yeah, and there's I mean the cops are conspicuous by their absence, so I guess good for that.
Yeah, yeah, it's a another story in a hopefully a trend that is starting where it is not propaganda.
Right.
And so next time we will be reading The Silver Blood Promise by James Logan, a book which I know very little about other than that it is relatively long and I believe it fits into the high fantasy, epic fantasy category. And so
Yes.
I'm looking forward to that. And as always, we hope to see you in the next episode. Hey, thanks for listening. You can follow us on Twitter at Staff Trenchcoat. Look for us on Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Feel free to shoot us an email at staffandtrenchcoat@gmail.com if you have a book recommendation. And we hope to see you in the next episode.